Okay, got a little bit of background noise going on, but hopefully we can get this done in a relatively reasonable way. All right, let's go ahead and review what we covered last time. Okay, so last time we were talking about Lukacs's take on Marxism, where instead of dealing with material reality as an object, he dealt with society as the object, and social connections is basically the essence of the object. And since every possible subjective reality was potentially part of the social object, the institution was required in order to adjudicate that. And so then you have the institution as being the ultimate arbiter, as opposed to man and his relationship with not only society, but also material reality. So, moving on. I place special emphasis on Western Marxism since these questions are obvious within the framework of the experience of Marxism-Leninism. There, the question of objectivity of society and communism were answered practically in the Soviet avant-garde and in the GPCR. I looked into the Soviet avant-garde, and the only thing Google is showing me is an artistic movement from the 1890s to the 1930s. Now, while I was living there, I had some conversations with a young woman who had studied history in college, and she told me about an avant-garde movement that had more to do with, experimentation with the family, experimentation with strange social situations. And this included experimentations with communal living and so on and so forth. And it turns out that most of these things didn't work, and they were abandoned relatively quickly. And the difference between what happened there and what's been happening with the woke movement in the U.S. is that they were able to determine what did and didn't work very quickly. And once they determined what did and didn't work, they adopted what did work and they abandoned what did not work. And that was it. So, for instance, they kept communal apartments, and if you wanted to have some space, they also had dachas for everyone. So you could go out to your dacha where you were growing your own food, right? And then during the winter, you would come stay in the city so that you could work, and you were living in these communal apartments. But you weren't trapped there. You could go out. You had a place in the country you could go to. But in the city, everything was more compact, and they resolved space issues by having communal apartments. The GPCR, I was completely unfamiliar with. I researched that, and I found a Wikipedia article. I'll go to that Wikipedia article now. And basically, it was the communist ultra left. So they were taking Mao's ideas to an extreme, right? Okay, self-defined as further left than the central Maoist leaders at the height of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, right? So this was taking Maoism to an extreme. And basically the function of this group was to sort of explore the limits of Maoist principles, right? So these two ideas served important functions within the Soviet Union and within Communist China, in that that's what drove the dialectic forward, because it took the thesis to its extreme so that way the contradictions could manifest themselves, and then you could develop a synthesis from there. All right. Moving on. Both of these events ran upon the objective limits of their underlying aspirations, and the wisdom of Marxism-Leninism, whether in socialism in one country or in Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up, defined itself in relation to that experience. So again, this is the practical application of the Hegelian dialectic and the materialist dialectic. So they actually consciously developed their society on the basis of the materialist dialectic, just like our elites or Baalites are implementing a dialectic against us to lead us in a non-constructive direction. They actually took control of that process to lead it in a constructive direction. Right? And this is what led to socialism in one country, which was Stalin's idea, which led to the largest economic growth in the history of Russia, and Deng Xiaoping's reforms, which enabled China to adapt to the global order and actually wildly profit from it, more so than any Western country. Right. Okay, moving on. Moreover, Marxism-Leninism is defined within the context of countries where the question of society and the individual is resolved in the concrete bonds of civilization, bonds which are never questioned, even at the height of revolutionary experimentation. So, in other words, there was never a question in these Eastern countries about who man was within the context of society. And if they were resolved within society. And they were able to do this because they never went through the Enlightenment and they never had to deal with the Cartesian radical doubt being the intellectual norm. So they never had that barrier that they had to overcome. And later on in this essay, Haas is going to get to why Heidegger is necessary in order for the West to get over that barrier. But the East, they never incorporated Heidegger because they never had to. Because Heidegger specifically dealt with the post-Cartesian world order, which they never had to deal with. In the comparatively atomized West, it is not at all clear to people to what extent society is objective, or to what extent ideas are subjective, even outside Marxist theory. Modern Western thinking doubts absolutely everything about society, even the definition of gender. So this is basically just summing up what we went over in terms of this radical Cartesian self-doubt and how that permeates Western society, and how this whole gender ideology thing is. He uses that as an example for the same reason that I do, which is that it's so radical that it lays bare the contradictions inherent in the Cartesian worldview. The very distinction between subject and object itself is not at all clear in Western society, which is extremely sensitive to algorithmically driven shifts in culture. Even scientific consensus is rightfully called into question, while expert opinion disguises itself as fact. So, in other words, this goes, if I understand it correctly, this is what he means by Lukacs' reification, right? Because since there's no clear difference between the subject and the object, the two reify each other, right? So that's what he's talking about when he's talking about being extremely sensitive to algorithmically driven shifts in culture. So there's this feedback loop, right, where it just becomes a gigantic echo chamber, right? And so there's no way to deal with materiality at all because it's being shouted down by this sort of algorithmically driven echo chamber. To the point where even scientific consensus has to be called into question because it no longer takes material reality for granted, right? Because it's hyper subjective. And so the only thing you have left is expert opinion, right? And expert opinion has to be the arbiter. So this goes back to what I'm saying about this radical, this radical doubt, this radical mistrust, this metaphysical mistrust, ultimately leads to expert opinion having to be the arbiter, as opposed to our relationship with our fellow man helping to arbitrate these unknowns. That doesn't mean that that can be thought of as sort of an absolute fact, right? But at the same time, it gets us all on the same page, right? And if we're all atomized like that, we can't all get on the same page, and so then we have to be arbitrated by institutions and expert opinion. In contrast to Lukacs' notion of reification, the real problem with subject-object distinction cannot but appear to be rooted in the notion of objective being implied by it, as totally purified of human quality, despite that in reality all objects appear somehow tainted by it. I'm going to read that one more time. In contrast to Lukacs' notion of reification, the real problem with the subject-object distinction cannot but appear to be rooted in the notion of objective being implied by it as totally purified of human quality, despite that in reality all objects appear to be somehow tainted by it. Right. So this whole idea of the subjective being the ultimate arbiter, again, this goes back to Descartes, right? Because for Descartes, his radical self-doubt led him to this idea that
we'll have them on the way. Thank you.
All right, keep on getting distracted here. I apologize. I am going to get some more equipment that'll that'll reduce the distractions when recording this. It's embarrassing, but it is what it is. All right. And I'm losing sort of my train of thought as well because of the amount of background noise that's taking place. For a minute there, it looked like we were having too much background noise, but
I jump on this way up now to get them.
But basically, there has to be this sort of idea of, okay, well, there's my subjective experience, and then there's an objective experience, and there's no necessary relationship between the subjective and the objective. And so you have this sort of dualism, right? But the reality is that sort of dualistic worldview is only valid in a limited sort of way, because there's actually a very strong relationship between an individual and material reality. The two have a feedback loop to affect one another in a serious way, and that's what I think he means by all objects appear somehow tainted by the human quality. Right? When the thinking consciousness is entirely divided from reality, again, going back to that Cartesian dualistic idea of the subject and the object, as pure spirit, soul, mind, or cogito, what remains of reality is completely meaningless and devoid of any moral, historical, spiritual, or human significance. How could that square with Marx's view below? This communism as fully developed naturalism equals humanism, and as fully developed humanism equals naturalism, it is the genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature and between man and man, the true resolution of the strife between existence and essence, between objectification and self-confirmation, between freedom and necessity, between the individual and the species. So here Marx is very explicit. He says it's not just between human and society. It's not just an individual in the state of nature, which would be the actual sort of libertarian response, which is, it's really, they really want to kind of, their instinct is to reduce things down to the individual in the state of nature. It's all three, right? It's the individual, it's the natural world, and it's society. It's all three of them together that form that are required for this material dialectic. And within this material dialectic, you have this tension. It's not even necessarily a strife or contradiction in the strict logical sense, but there's a tension there, right? There's this tension between man and nature, between man and man, right? Between the simple objective reality and this essence and meaning, between things interpreted as objects versus things interpreted subjectively, between your individual freedoms and the needs of the society, and ultimately between the individual and the species, right? And this tension is what drives the dialectic forward. And material reality outside of man and society, but related to man and society, is extremely key to understanding this. And we're going to leave it there for today.